Welcome back. All right, so first off, yes, I'm wearing a baseball jersey and a baseball hat. I'm wearing a San Diego Padres hat, obviously, and a Toronto Blue Jays jersey. The Jays are doing pretty well, and I figured it's summer. I can get a little bit more casual with it. So, sure, I'll wear baseball. And since I'm talking about other sports in this video today, too, I thought, why not? So, the National Hockey League has just had its free agent period, and things are quiet. And things are quiet while they're noisy in other leagues. And I wanted to talk a bit about how noisy things can be in other leagues and how I think that helps them. So, today in the National Basketball Association, we saw a record set when 7 teams were involved in one trade. One. And I would love to have done a video on that on the Entertainment Guy and gone into that 7-team trade, but I don't follow the NBA closely enough to really get into all of the intricacies of a major trade like that. But it reminded me of something that we see in the National Hockey League. A lot of sameness. This free agent period was quiet because a lot of teams decided to hold on to players, and a lot of players decided to stay where they were. There were some that wanted change, but when teams knew they wanted change, they moved them before July the 1st. Marner's a good example. Rantanen's another example. And these players signed extensions before we got to July the 1st. So that excitement, that excitement of a trade comes through, but we don't get that free agency, and we don't get anything like a bonkers 7-team trade. We do see 3-team trades in the National Hockey League, but usually one of the 3 teams is just there to take on money. They might get a mid-round draft pick for it, and that's it. They don't actually get any other assets out of it. So we're not like, hey, these 3 guys have all switched teams. I'm pretty sure we've seen 3-team trades in the NHL going way back, and that they used to involve every team getting players out of that trade. The Matt Duchene one is the most recent one that I can think of that was prominent when he went to Colorado, and Nashville made out pretty well in that one. Or Duchene went from Colorado to Ottawa. And interestingly enough, the only team that didn't seem to benefit from that trade was Ottawa. But it was a 3-way trade. And it was incredible. It was bonkers. And I think that's something the NHL needs. And I don't know how you encourage that. I wanted to use an example from each league. So, like Ohtani. Before Ohtani went from the Angels to the Dodgers, there was all kinds of talk about where he might go. The Blue Jays were one of the teams to be rumored to be in on him. And it was seen as a potential for Ohtani to really turn the Blue Jays into a contender if he'd gone there, but instead he goes to the Dodgers. Now, in the NFL, the other big league in North America, right, quarterbacks regularly changing teams, and that goes back a long way. There are examples of veteran players being moved in every league, NHL included, when they're past their prime, and so their prime years might be spent in one place. But it feels like we see more liberal movement in other leagues, and I think it makes it a little more exciting. There is sort of a sameness from one year to another with the NHL, so I just wanted to look at some players that haven't moved, have stayed in one place. Crosby, his whole career in Pittsburgh, which is great. But think about it. What if Crosby in, say, 2014 had decided, I'd like to play on the West Coast, and if he'd gone out to, say, Anaheim for 4 years on a deal, and then after that deal was done, maybe he goes to the Rangers, maybe he got, and I know this seems like sacrilege, but would the NHL have got more press if there was more movement when it came to their star players? Ovechkin's another example. He's been a Capital his entire career. I'm not saying he shouldn't be, but for the sake of excitement and fun and something different, just imagine if he'd played in Montreal for a while. Imagine if he had played for Colorado at one point. That kind of thing, right? Where he's moving around. And I'm not saying Mike Sillinger levels of being moved to, almost half the league, but some kind of movement I think would help. Now, obviously, McDavid's a free agent next summer. And 2 things could happen here. Either he re-signs in Edmonton, or he gets traded before July the 1st and signs somewhere else. The odds of Connor McDavid actually hitting the unrestricted free agent market next July 1st, I honestly think they're near 0. And the National Hockey League would love to have a July the 1st where McDavid's choosing between 31 different teams that want his services, 32 when you include the fact Edmonton wouldn't have given up at that point, right? So I think that this is something that the National Hockey League would love to see, but we just don't. Nathan MacKinnon, Is anybody going to be surprised if he spends his entire career in Colorado? I won't be. Kucherov's been in Tampa a long time. He's going to stay in Tampa. Draisaitl, well, he's starting an 8-year extension with Edmonton. No reason to think he's going anywhere. Barkov in Florida. There's no way Barkov's going anywhere. And I'm not saying that these players shouldn't, just there's a sameness from one year to the next. Makar in Colorado. Is anybody going to be surprised in 2027 when he decides to sign an 8-year extension? I won't be. Matthews in Toronto. He's had opportunities to leave Toronto now, and he hasn't. He's decided to stay there. And so while we've seen Marner move on, it feels like that was as much Toronto deciding to move on as it might have been Marner. I think if Toronto had gone to Marner with a really good contract offer, and I think if Marner really believed in all of that, he probably would have stuck around, right? Pastrnak in Boston, I don't think he's ever going anywhere. Hellebuck in Winnipeg, he had a chance to become a free agent, decided to sign a long-term extension with Winnipeg. Vasilevsky in Tampa, no reason for him to go anywhere. Victor Hedman also in Tampa, no reason for him to go anywhere, and he's in his he's 35, 36 at this point. Mark Scheifele in Winnipeg, another player who had a chance to move on. And this is where it's interesting, too. This has been brought up with Besser, Demko, and Garland all signing extensions in Vancouver. It is interesting to note how many American players want to stay in Canadian markets. So in this case, you've got Hellebuck for Winnipeg, right? Could have gone and played on any American team he wanted to and decided to stay in Winnipeg. Then you got Kopitar with the LA Kings. He's never going anywhere. And I picked Yossi as well from Nashville, just as examples of players who are with one franchise. And that's great for the league, and it's great for those franchises. But could it be better for the league, while it might hurt some of these franchises, if we had more liberal movement? Now, there's been some factors that have made a difference. So the flat cap and teams spending to the cap ceiling have definitely limited the number of trades we've seen. And the flat cap meant that the league had money, the players weren't getting as much because of the money owed from 2020 and 2021. Now we're seeing the salary cap going up, so we'll come back to that in a moment here. Players, it feels like hockey players are more loyal. That players, when given the option between staying or going somewhere brand new, it feels like they're more likely to stick around. They're more likely to play. Like I've argued before about players that have stayed long-term with Ottawa, Winnipeg, etc. And the argument's always been, well, yeah, but they drafted those players. Right. Players are loyal. And if the team that drafted them treats them well, and they get paid well, not necessarily the most they're going to get from anywhere in the league, but they're paid pretty darn well, they're going to stay. And I don't have a problem with that. But it definitely leads to a little bit less exciting offseason than what we're seeing with the NBA, what we're getting with the NFL, and what we get with baseball every year, it seems. When there's some big names that get moved, it feels like every year in the baseball world. And then there's also public perception. When a player comes out in hockey and says, well, I'd like to go somewhere else, immediately they're disloyal. They're booed by the fans. And it's weird. I don't take offense when a player says they don't want to play for a team I root for. If a Canuck came out next week and said, I'd actually like to get moved, I don't see that as disloyalty. I see it as honesty. And it doesn't bother me because I know there will always be players who want to play for teams I root for. And if they don't, then there's a problem with the organization. At least that's how I see it. I don't get mad at the players for not wanting to play there. I ask, why? Why do they want out? Is there a way to talk them out of it? And if there isn't, what can they get back for said player? But there is this perception with hockey players. I'd like to go somewhere else. Well, that's not very loyal of you. We like players around here who are loyal. Such a bizarre, to me anyways, it's a bizarre way of looking at it. When teams aren't that loyal to players, if you look over the history of the National Hockey League, the teams have not necessarily been that loyal to the players over the years. No trade and no movement clause. Those definitely cause less movement. They don't prevent movement, though. But what it does is, so if I have a no movement clause, it doesn't mean I'm not going to get traded. It means a team comes to me and goes, hey, so we're going to trade you to Punxsutawney. You're going to Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania. And my answer might be, the hell I am. And that's it. The conversation's over. It doesn't matter what trade they negotiated. I just said no. And it's gone. It's done. I don't mind players having trade protection for the reasons I mentioned before. Teams have shown no loyalty And over the years, we've seen some interesting trades being made. And so I understand players wanting that level of certainty where a team might turn around one day and say, we signed you to that deal a couple years ago, but we really like this other player better, so we want to move you out so we can afford to sign him. Maybe you're going to be like, I don't feel like waiving my no movement clause. The interesting thing is, when that comes out publicly, when it's known, then fans scream and media will scream about disloyalty and how they're hurting the team. Why won't they accept this trade? They're hurting the team. They're looking out for themselves. They have that trade protection for that very reason, and the team gave them that trade protection clearly in negotiations, going, oh yeah, no, we like you. We're keeping you. You're the guy. You're it. And so for 2 years later, to come to that same person and go, actually, they're better, and they're going to be cheaper, so we want to move your contract. I totally get a player saying no. 8-year contracts don't help either. So you already have the no trade, the no move. It's so weird to me how the no trade, no movement clause is supposed to be attached to a contract where a player is making a little bit less than they might get on the market in exchange for that trade protection. Somewhere along the way, players got both. They get the money they want and they get the trade protection at the same time. Pretty tidy piece of work by the NHLPA, isn't it? And it leaves teams in a tough situation where now they've signed a player to an 8-year contract, especially if they sign that player to an 8-year contract, and maybe the first 2 years of that contract they don't perform well, you're stuck with them. That's it. Now, those contracts are going to drop to 7 years, and so in free agency, instead of it being 7 years, it'll be 6 years. So that changes things a little bit, but I don't think it's going to create more liberal movement. Now, I do think it would be in the NHL's best interest, and I don't know how you legislate this. I don't think you can. I think it's cultural, but the NHL needs more movement, more change. What we're talking about right now, so I'm doing these videos looking at next season, and I will continue every day. I will do another team, and we'll look at next season and what it might look like for them. But the core of almost every team has stayed the same. There's been no functional change necessarily. Now, because hockey does have an element of randomness to it, it means that next season you could very well get two completely different teams in the Stanley Cup final. The playoffs could go completely differently. But the core team is probably going to be the same. We just next year would get a redemption story of, well, these guys didn't get it done last year, but they got it done this year. But if there was more movement, if we saw more core guys move, it's one thing I liked about the Marner trade. Even though that was signed before July the 1st, which kind of ripped us off on July the 1st, didn't it? But I like the idea that Vegas went out and got Marner, and we'll see how that changes things this season. It is a massive change to their roster. He plays a different style of hockey, and so it's going to change things. It forces change for Toronto as well. They have to replace that production for Marner. So now we're hearing trade rumors around the Leafs that have some validity to them because we know the Leafs need another productive forward. You can't just lose Marner for nothing. So and I'm not saying Nick Raw is nothing, but Nick Raw is not that kind of productive forward. He's going to give them excellent minutes on that third line, but they still need a top 6 winger, don't they? Now the cap rising should help. The cap going up should. Now I'm saying should because, well, we've already seen, we're only a week into July, there's a lot of teams that are already at or over the cap. And so there will be more movement, I think, this season, but there are still going to be some contending teams that will want to make trades during the season and want to create change that won't be able to do it because they're not going to have cap space. It's going to have to be dollar out, dollar in, or that's where you bring in a third party so that they can take on some of the money so you can trade that contract to that third team. And then it's just, that's the kind of deals we're going to get again. So one thing, though, about the cap rising is we could end up with haves and have-nots. And this is what the NHL doesn't want. So going by franchise valuation, your haves would be Toronto, clearly. Toronto, if we didn't have a salary cap, their roster would be paid probably the $150 million range. Like, they'd have so much money to spend on so many players. MLSE makes so much cash. The Rangers, very similar. The Rangers, before we had a salary cap, the Rangers in Toronto were not shy about spending money. Montreal, same thing. The LA Kings are a pretty rich organization as well. Boston, Edmonton, Chicago. Chicago does get a reputation here and there for being a little cheap with their money. Boston gets that too, but the money's there. So if we were in a non-salary cap situation, these teams would be able to spend copious amounts of money. Philadelphia, when we didn't have a cap before, Philadelphia wasn't shy about spending money. Washington, Detroit. There's been some debate about how much money they spend, but take away a salary cap and watch that go through the roof. New Jersey, not really known as a huge spender. Vancouver, I went back and forth on this initially when I did the haves, have-nots. I thought about just putting up the teams that I felt like would spend the most amount of money. And it got dodgy really quick. So I thought, no, I'll go by franchise valuations. I don't know if the Canucks would be a have or a have-not, because there have been times where it felt like the NHL, without the salary cap, the Canucks should have been. And salary-wise, they kind of were. But then you look at the results they had with a very highly paid roster, it wasn't necessarily adding up. Dallas and Vegas would also qualify based on franchise valuations. But over here in the square, I put Colorado, St. Louis, Tampa, and Florida, because those four organizations will spend money when they're able to. And I don't think money is an object, despite their franchise valuations not being that high. And it's interesting because it's not that long ago that we were talking about Florida being cheap, using contracts to get to the cap floor, and how they weren't like a legitimate organization and they should be out of Florida. You got to move them somewhere that's going to make more money, like Quebec City, because that's what always comes up. So it is interesting how things have changed. And then the four least valuated franchises are Ottawa, Buffalo, Winnipeg, and Columbus. And those four franchises at times have been on players' no trade lists. And part of it is that they're small market. They may not be seen as a lucrative market. One thing that you have to keep in mind, too, that doesn't get brought up a lot is endorsements. Being able to cut commercials locally and maybe nationally. If you play in Toronto, ask Austin Matthews. You can do a whole bunch of commercials nationally. Same with Connor McDavid in Edmonton. So if you sign somewhere like Buffalo, if you sign even Winnipeg, I think to some extent, and Columbus, you might lose out on some of that money, which is not factored into your salary with the National Hockey League at all. So I've been thinking about doing a video on not just the whole no tax thing, because that gets brought up a lot, but on endorsements and on market size and all that fun stuff, because there's a lot of things that go into where a player might want to play. But I think that the interesting thing for me is we're into this offseason where there's been some movement, not as much as I think a lot of us would have liked to have seen. As much as I love Besser coming back to Vancouver, and I'm so happy he's back, not seeing that movement, it really limits the kind of change you might see in certain locations. Now, the most popular topics when it comes to hockey, trade rumors and trade speculation are at the top, because that's change. It's change. And when you get change, it means that there's a franchise whose fan base might have some more hope. They might be like, we don't really like what this core's got done. Well, now they've traded a couple guys out, brought a couple guys in. I think these guys could get it done. We don't see that. And I'm old enough, being very old, to remember a time when you could make big changes. Back in the 80s, you could make big changes. Sometimes it's veteran guys, and I know sometimes with moves made in other leagues too, it'll be guys when they're in their early or mid-30s. But you still do see younger players moving around in other leagues, and the National Hockey League doesn't have that as much as other leagues, and it does kind of feel like everything's a little static. Expansion speculation always gets a lot of attention. It gets attention two ways. One, people want to see it, and people don't want to see it. But almost everybody has an opinion on the expansion conversation, the NHL being at 32 teams. I think every league is going to expand over the next 10 years. I wouldn't be surprised if the NHL tries to beat them to it and get that headline for making further expansion. And I'm not here to decide whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I remember when we had 21 teams in the NHL, and some of them weren't very good. Some of them just weren't very good. And I think there were players who played in the National Hockey League back in the 80s that would not make it to the NHL now. I think the skill level's higher. I think the fitness level's better. But again, it is just a matter of opinion, isn't it? And then actual trades and signings. Always a popular topic. Always something people get excited about. And it's something that I think the NHL misses out on a little bit. And because of this culture where a player wanting out means they're disloyal, loyalty is definitely important. I think hockey players being a little more down to earth than superstars in other sports. And that's been a topic for as long as I've watched hockey as well. That hockey players seem to be the nicest guys out of the four major leagues in terms of, being approachable and guys you can just talk to and more down to earth. I think that lends itself to guys being a little more loyal and being more likely to say, well, yeah, I could go out onto the free agent market and maybe make an extra $1 million a year, but I'd like to stay here. So it is something that I think the NHLPA might pay some attention to, although I don't know how you would deal with this. Do you call up the players and go, stop being so loyal, go to the market, drive up prices, drive up costs? I don't think that message would resonate very well. And considering we're going to have labor peace now until 2030, fingers crossed on that, of course, you just never know when things might change. I wonder if we're ever going to see that change. I think it needs to change, but I'd be interested to know your thoughts. The National Hockey League does not seem to have the liberal movement of players that I think would benefit the league. I think it'd benefit the players too. There are certainly some players who had rough seasons in 2024, 2025 who could really benefit from a change of scenery. But loyalty and a determination that we're going to come back next year, we're going to do it better, we're going to figure this out, can lead to further frustration and some setbacks. There will be exceptions to that, but definitely feels like we do see some setbacks, and then you've worsened your trade value, and it can get really kind of ugly fast. So I'd be interested to know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and let me know how you feel. Do you think the NHL's just, at this point, everything kind of stays the same and static for the most part, which can make it a little more boring to cover? And I'm saying that as a YouTuber who covers hockey, it can. There are definitely some times this year where I've seen a player sign an extension and thought, well, there goes, I was kind of looking forward to see what would happen with him on July the 1st. I think there's some players who might have left a lot of money on the table out of loyalty rather than go to market and see what they could get. But I'd be interested to know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. It's greatly appreciated. I will talk to you again soon.